And I cough right as we go live. Awesome. Welcome, everyone, to actually the last session of Fly on the Wall, the virtual connecting study group at Literacy Research Association. And this is our exploration to seeing how that we can increase remote attendees, increase in the equity, really build off the work that awesome folks like Rebecca and Maha have done to bring conferences to people around the world who cannot afford to actually get to those conferences. This year, I am one of those people. So with that being said, I just want to go ahead and if we can introduce, I'm going to have the on-site buddies introduce themselves, and then I will have the virtual buddies introduce themselves, and we'll start on the left with Vanessa.
Unmute.
Oh, sorry. I was an on-site, but I mixed up. Why don't we start in the back with Jonathan? We'll just go all the way around. Jonathan, why don't you do your introduction?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Bartels from the University of Alaska Anchorage.
That's all you got? You can give us a little more.
Oh, what else do you want? Sorry.
I don't know. One random fact. Give me a random fact. What do you like to study? What do you like to? What's your favorite food? Anything.
Thanks
a random fact.
My dogs are currently hanging out in a truck in Alaska.
Perfect. That's awesome.
I'm Rebecca Ho, co-founder and co-director of Virtually Connecting. And this is my first LRA. And a random fact, I can see that Michelle is one of my academic supervisors.
I'm Katie Paciga. I'm an associate professor of education at Columbia College in Chicago. Random fact. I love hockey. The sport of hockey. I follow it ambitiously.
And the Flyers should have never fired Hextall. But okay.
Hi, I'm Tom Lynch. I'm an associate professor of educational technology at Pace University in New York City. And random facts, I love MLS football, soccer, and particularly the New York City Football Club, to whom we have season tickets, but who have not made it to the finals.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go. I'm Christina de Silva Iddings, and I'm at Vanderbilt University. I am a professor of language and culture and literacy. And a random fact is that I love to samba. I'm from Brazil, and so it's not quite as random as it could be.
Well, that's welcome to all of our on-site buddies. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've had a busy conference. It's Friday. It's just wrapping up, and you're tired. So thank you for being here with us. And with that, why don't we introduce our virtual buddies. I know that we don't have sound from Kristen, but she's with us, so I just wanted to say hello for her, and then we will start with Lauren if you want to say hello.
Hi everybody, I'm Lauren Zucker, coming at you from rainy New York City area, and I'm a reading researcher and high school English teacher. And my random fact is that I made chicken soup for the first time ever yesterday.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, Lauren.
Nice to see some familiar faces and new friends.
Michelle?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, my name is Michelle Hegerman. Nice to see you. Hi, Rebecca. So great to see you here in this space. Tom, I just met last week? At NCT, yeah. So I'm an assistant professor of educational technologies at the University of Ottawa, and in Ottawa, Canada. And a random fact about me: I really love superhero movies. More than hockey, which it's a very complex relationship that I have with hockey, right? In my world. So yeah, I really love superhero movies.
Wait.
Vanessa?
Vanessa here from the northeast corner of Colorado, and I just want you, my random fact is that I actually decorated for Maha today, and she's not here. Acquired while I too, back in the years gone by when I was at the American University of Cairo.
Oh, I didn't know you worked there too as well.
No, I didn't work there. I was an undergraduate.
Oh, wow.
Classes to go out to the other things.
Well, hopefully maybe she can hop in and join us.
Yeah, I'm sure she will. Hi, everyone.
It's bedtime at her house. I know how that is. Like, I always say, I will be there between 8 and never if it's around bedtime.
That's it. My name's Wendy Tallio, and I'm currently located right down the south coast of Australia. And my random fact is the picture behind me, I'm also doing decorations like Vanessa. It's a 3-dimensional padded kookaburra. So that's quite random.
No, in my head all
and
day.
really happy to join you there.
I'm a preschool teacher. I just said that song's going to be in my head all day.
I thought about Girl Scouts when she said kookaburra.
So I think Friday's such a day of reflection because you have at LRA, and for those who aren't familiar with it, that's when they give out their annual awards. We're all familiar with that Antero's work. He got, for example, the Early Career Award. Dr. Mole got the, for Lewis Mole for all of his work, and that's why I was really excited to have such an international crowd on because to discuss kind of his work. He was given the Lifetime Achievement Award. We also have the town hall. So there's so much to discuss on Fridays. But first, we wanted to bring up the talk of there was a lot of debate yesterday on Twitter between screens, and not just screen time for children, but screen time for scholars. And so let's start there. How do we define screens in reading? And I'll start with the on-site guests first.
Sure. Who wants to?
Yeah, so Bill Thiel, in his last language arts piece, said that the technology has changed everything about how we communicate and interact with one another. And so I like to cast a wide net when I consider what it means
Katie, can you squeeze into the frame a little bit?
I can.
There you go.
I like to cast a wide net when I consider what it means to read online. I tend to lean to the web literacies framework. Are we reading, writing, and participating? And when you're doing any one of those, it's a dialectical, like between audience and reader. And when we read, we actually are writing a narrative in our heads. And so then talking about when you bring a screen into that process, what happens to each of those sort of actors in that interaction. And screens take on so many forms. And I'm currently at this place in my thinking where I'm thinking about AI. It's run through a screen in large parts, but is that part of what we're talking about when we're talking about reading and screens and the way that factors in there?
Yeah, for sure.
Go ahead. Sure. So I have a little bit of a different take on screens, where I think it's actually really useful considering whether or not screens exist in the way that we talk about them. Meaning, at the end of the day, they're a piece of glass, usually or plastic, on a device. And I actually think that that's not. I think that by focusing on the word screen in too much of our research, we actually sometimes run the risk of oversimplifying the nature of like researching digital literacies. In reality, the way I think about it is that there are the literacy practices that are above the screen, and there are literacy practices that are below the screen. And most of what I think the field has focused on is what I call super screenic literacies. So they're interested in the literacy practices that occur using devices or using computers or things like that, and implying and creating different kinds of methodological and conceptual frameworks to make sense of them. And that's rich and necessary. So 100%. I also think it at most is 50% of what we could be researching, because beneath the glass, beneath the screen, is a whole world of literacies that are computational in nature. The whole to be digital is to be software is to be comprised of languages. And those languages are studyable in way, and they affect what happens above the screen. So for instance, if you were to, let's say you were doing a study where you were pulling Instagram photos of, a particular online group or something along like that, it would be incomplete to just study the ways in which let's say students are talking about something on Instagram, and even using multimodal methods of composing communications. Like, that's all rich and that's interesting. It's also, if you do that kind of study and you don't also look at the metadata that's associated with those pictures, if you don't question the terms of service and the kinds of data that Instagram made available to you as a researcher, and if you don't account for the fact that those terms of service and those metadata available to you will change in a year, which makes the study you did irreplicable in certain ways, then I think we're missing half. We're missing half of the literacy practice that are actually part of the digital world. So I've come to, my stance on the screen question is that it's more useful to start from a place of thinking that the screen doesn't exist. Actually, it would be like a comp and rhetoric scholar focusing on studying paper. Like, it's there, it's part of it, but it's kind of like not even the point. Like, the point is everything else that's happening around it. So and we would never call it paper studies. And if you did, you'd get a lot of research that's well-intentioned but off the right path. So I think the word screen is actually dangerous, and I think it limits us conceptually and methodologically when it comes to doing this work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think any historians have found research of when, it'd be destroyed now, but of books being dangerous, or, it's like the kids are, they're spending way too much time with books. But at the same sense, and I was explaining this yesterday, we do have to realize, and talking about Tom's being critical, is we do have to realize that these firms do hire cognitive scientists to make those to put a lot of weight under that screen that does mess with our children, ourselves, each other. And I was talking about this yesterday, is something's different when my kids are their video game time, which is like, well, why am I making that video game time? But if they have one-to-one devices versus when they're co-playing on, say, the Switch, turning them off is for me, it's a personal hell. I was like, oh crap, it's like their time limit's coming up. I got to go tell them. I prep myself up. So what's happening to young kids that doesn't happen to me when I need to take away something else? It really only happens with that device when it's that close to them. And so to me, it scares me a little bit as a parent. Any thoughts or?
I agree with you there, Greg.
Yeah, disagreement. All right, so we'll moving from there. Go ahead,
Greg, a little
bit.
Okay,
please do.
I think the focus on the screen is a very micro level sort of unit of analysis. And when we consider the screen and what it does to children's lives, especially today, we see more parents that have more homes that have two working parents, less adult attention. If we consider the interpersonal relational dynamics that sort of afford children more extended opportunities with screen. So there's that two parents are working, and that's from a very white suburban middle class ideology, right? So I'm sort of couching that and that. But at my house, we both work. So kids come home until 5. I need them occupied and doing something in a safe place where I don't have to pull my attention up for the last 2 hours of my workday when I'm grading, right? And so the screens serve that purpose. The other thing that's happening is that you see fewer and fewer children outside in neighborhoods in spontaneous open-ended play. We're running from one structured activity to another as parents after school. And so for at least for my kids, the screens in that time period where they're using them represent the only time of the day that it is an unstructured, child-driven, interest-driven sort of time. And oftentimes that happens with peer interaction, right? And so I understand if you tell a child playing in a playground who's deeply engaged in a preschool or kindergarten age level context, it's time to go from the playground, you see the similar sort of emotional sort of meltdown. And so I think if we open it up to a larger macro cultural kind of conversation, it sort of starts to make sense.
So with Tom, we need to study the metadata under the screen, and Katie says we need to study the metadata around the screen.
It's ecological.
It's a dialectic, like the superscrenic and the subscrenic. They're constantly informing each other. And there's also an element to this. I have an 8-year-old son. Like there's like social cachet to like being fluent in Minecraft and being able to like,
if you don't know the Fortnite dance.
That's right. Like if you don't, oh my God, don't even. Like, yes. but the point
You're
is
not
that
cool anymore.
No, that's
if you
right.
don't.
So the point too is that like what appears on the surface to be solo activities with a kid in a screen, to the kid it often isn't.
It's cultural capital.
It's totally cultural capital, right? And even the watching of the YouTube videos, his name is Declan. I was like, Declan, you keep watching these videos and I don't understand and all this kind of thing. The fact is, like, he watches a lot of tutorial videos to learn how to do things in Minecraft so that he can go and like, show his chops to his friends, right? And I'm actually all down with it. In part because I see Minecraft as building up, having the potential to build up to the subscrenic for him, which is like if you keep getting into Minecraft, what you start to realize is like if you play the canned versions of the games, you're limited in terms of what you can do. But there's also a whole world of hacking the games and of doing this whole other realm to it that will get you below the screen. So I'm like very in support of him doing Minecraft, not because of the short term, though it's fine and it's valuable, but also because I see it as an on-ramp into some of these subscrenic literacies that, that I fully intend to immerse him in, in all sorts of ways as he gets older.
It's so funny to consider though that the YouTube is the teacher, right? And it gets back to that like Fred Rogers and Sesame Street serving as the curriculum, right? For a whole generation of kids. And like this generation of children is reliant on YouTube, which so many of the people that put stuff on YouTube understand so little about development in children. And to me, that's really
or they know way too much.
The wrong kinds of things.
The algorithmic videos that are being pumped out, like there are machine-driven children. They've gotten rid of most of them, but they had to purge many of the machine-driven ad. These were just you talk about these were YouTube videos directed at 2 to 4-year-olds, written by artificial machine learning.
I'm wondering if anyone else online has some comments.
Perfect. Is anybody watching Twitter to see if questions come in? I don't have that. I'll keep it flipping. But is there an audience today, Rebecca, or are you guys the only ones in the room?
Meg's in the room.
Okay.
I'm checking Twitter. So go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I completely identify with a lot of the ideas that Tom and Katie expressed about the social capital that comes with active participation and knowledges for our kids. And like you, Tom, I have always been a massive encourager, enabler of Minecraft because for me, that is a completely different use of screen, if you will. And I really do agree with your point about screen being not the right word for the issues that we need to think about. But I mean, the creative like agency that my daughters have found through their interaction with that particular game space it's incredible. It absolutely blows my mind. And like my kid wears like a creeper backpack to school and she's so proud of that. And that like, and it's a hand-me-down from her older sister who wore it 3 years ago because, right. And I mean, and at NCTE, I was even talking about how participation in like these online virtual worlds during times of like really difficult transition for kids. I mean, so a few years ago, we moved right from Michigan to Ottawa, and my daughter felt displaced. She felt confused. She was sad because she missed her friends, and she was using this online game called Animal Jam to really reinforce and strengthen new friendships that she was making in the schoolyard at school. And then she would rush home and she would play with those same kids online. And I mean, you know, and there were a lot of like hard lessons also learned, you know, when she was hacked by one of these like really clever kids that she recognized, you know, was using some hack that they probably learned on YouTube, right? So there was that, like, she kind of respected the kid, like for having like tricked her in some ways. because she understood the culture, right, of like the creative play that was happening. But there is actually good that comes from interactions for children that are open, that are creative, that are driven entirely by their interests. And I feel like I'm kind of a lonely voice actually in my neighborhood, sort of with these perspectives, because the discourses around the dangers, I don't deny, right, that there are all kinds of reasons that, you know, these technologies can be addictive and they correlate with anxiety and depression and all of those things that we know are real. But I also think the flip is that when you have conversations about agency and creativity and collaboration and participation with your kids, there can be some good things that come from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. And Jonathan, I was trying to engage. You were talking, and I don't know what session you were in yesterday, because this parallels with that. You said there was a comment in the room, and I don't even know what session you're at, about, well, should we expect literacy researchers to be able to know all this back? Like, to do what Tom's talking about, you need some technical skills. What was the context? I know I'm setting them up. What was the context for that, of that comment? What session were you in? What was that about? I mean, it was probably don't even remember because it was a random tweet.
But no, it was what was the title of it?
I have no idea.
I can't.
Something about screen time.
So it was screen time. So.
Screen time magic.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that what the real comment was about is it was getting into that idea and challenging the idea of coding language. And I think it was based in the perception that that type of thing is not accessible. Either, you know, almost kind of physically not accessible, or not physically, but you all know what I'm saying. Intellectually not accessible.
Yeah, it takes work.
It was kind of the idea that I can read it like the Matrix type of thing, versus I can get into it and I can decode bits and elements and get to information, and there's really valuable stuff that we could approach as literacy researchers. I mean, in the ways we do our studies, you know, doing discourse analysis, that kind of thing, really fascinating. And so I think that it was part of that disconnect that was the pushback, and I just thought it was an interesting framing for thinking about it.
And Tom, it looked like you were very skeptical of the even the question. So you want to hop in there?
It was in response to the Q&A part at the end of our session yesterday, right? And I really appreciated the dialogue from colleagues on the idea that the subscreening literacies, they were questioning whether those subscreening literacies, computational languages, are really the domain of literacy researchers. And part of the point was that if you're studying digital phenomena, or if you're using digital methods in general, like, you have to account for the nature of the digital.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, then you run the risk of the work that you're doing, like, not having the impact it could, and not, you know, and all sorts of things. So the main point, though, to the group was, the main pushback was that, you know, it sounds like what you're asking us to do is, like, you're asking us to, like, dive into, like, coding languages and do, like, analysis, and, like, we're not equipped to do that. And it was a fair point. It was an inaccurate point, though, too, maybe because I wasn't clear enough. It's like, there's a continuum between, like, not looking at any of these kinds of subscreening literacies at all, and, like, diving into, like, you know, source code, you know. And over here are a lot of methods that you can use that can really open up, you know, new forms of data collection and new methods. So for example, one of the things you can do if you're studying any sort of digital platform, let's say, is you can look at the developer documents that the company used to create the platform. Those developer documents are written in, like, human readable languages. And they will show you how the developers, for example, what data they're collecting, how they've started to, like, approach that data collection, what assumptions. You can analyze it critically and say, what assumptions are they making about our children and learning, just based on the kind of data that they're collecting. Another example, you can literally, on your computer right now, you can right-click on any web page and just view source. And if you just you scroll through view source, you can see all sorts of, like, shady links to, you know, advertisement agencies, and, you know, and all of these, like, little, you know, hidden languages that are going to give you some insight to the web pages and things that you're looking at. Another example, you could easily set up, like, what's called packet sniffing software that would allow you to, like, it's what hackers use to, like, intercept signals and, like, do all that. Like, and you can actually see what these packets of information being sent to and from different kinds of educational apps on phones. Are they encrypted? What kind of data are they actually transmitting? What happens when I capture this data and I apply some discourse analysis, or I apply some critical discourse analysis to this kind of, like, computational language? So the point is that you don't need to be a coder. There's actually a lot of methods you can do. The point is that we don't know what they are, and we're not experimenting.
Christina, do you have any thoughts to this, or?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely have lots of thoughts.
Or just I can call you later.
I'm in early childhood language learning, so I work with immigrant families, mostly immigrant children. And so, when I think about literacy in the screen, I think about multilingual, multimodal composition. So it's a little bit of a different conversation than what you are bringing to the table here. But I find that to be a real affordance in breaking through, the idea of language as a code and bringing in to a more complex understanding of language that includes translanguaging, that includes transnationalism, and a form of fluidity in language and culture, and for children especially, as they compose collaboratively in multiple languages. So it naturalizes a kind of translanguaging in the classroom. It naturalizes a kind of treatment of language that is not, just a translation exercise or a word for word, or even centering English as the
gold standard.
The standard.
Yeah, I have to say, like, partly I'm not into the decentralized web. I'm all for, like, a super hyper localized web. I think we need to support native tongues and indigenous communities, small group communities on the web. An English only web is not an open web. And I think what Tom, and the other thing I think we can do is, and this is my advocacy and I'm, without trying to get too nerdy, is I'm trying really hard to advocate for a web that stays human readable first, keeping all of my metadata directly in the HTML. And that's a technique that I won't bring up here. If you would have came to when I did Indie Web Camp at Pace, I don't think you were in town, but we sponsored Indie Web Camp at Pace. We'll do it again in September, so maybe you can go to that next one. But yeah, I think we got to try to keep. That's how I try to do it, is working on those elements of keeping it human readable and really investing in local communities. That to me is a major equity, social justice issue, is not losing the local love and communities that exist in our literacies as we move into these digital spaces. And the prescriptive worlds of Instagram, and yes, communities carve out their little niches, but let's build communities first. How can we as educators, like, what role and responsibilities do we have to protecting the web as educators?
I just wanted to invite Lauren if she had any questions to the on-site folk, or any comments.
Thank you, Wendy. My mind is spinning thinking about all the comments I've heard, but about that kind of fair point that was raised in the Q&A. How can I, as a literacy researcher, be expected to be well versed also in computational languages? I'm not also an educational technologist or computer scientist, etc. Does anyone know of some kind of reader-friendly resources for the literacy researcher who's wanting to not neglect what's below the screen, but is not well versed in algorithms and maybe isn't comfortable reading the legalese terms of service and interpreting what they mean?
Oh yeah, no, I'm also trying to, like, do my own mic control, because I'm aware that I get, like, and I'm having coffee, as you might have noticed. I mean, so one is I have a blog, gradgrinds.com, gradgrinds.com, which is named after Thomas Gradgrinds from Dickens Hard Times. On there, I just posted from a session at from LRA I posted a bunch of resources. So it's one of the posts at the top. I think it's called Body Electric.
Is that the one you tweet?
Yeah,
you put it out on
right
Twitter.
after, right?
Yeah.
So that's got some resources there. I'd also I wrote a book a few years ago against the recommendation of my chair. Actually, I wrote a book because I needed to work out a lot of this stuff, and I needed something more than an article. But the book's called The Hidden Role of Software in Educational Research, Policy to Practice. And in there's a book on methods that most of which are kind of pulled from the the web development kind of world, and there's a specific chapter on here are methods that are used outside of educational research, broadly speaking, that you can actually adapt and apply. And if you're interested in that, you can't afford it too, I would also say email me and I can help you out. But I also think some working groups on these sorts of things, it isn't as hard as you think, it's just unknown. And when you run through a couple of examples of something, it actually becomes, especially developer documents where it's the closest you're going to get to the black box that a lot of these technologies, these companies rely on. You're never going to be able to break down an actual algorithm from a company. It's proprietary, but you can reverse engineer it based on the behaviors you're seeing. Or
if you ever want to study bad writing for understanding,
right. Yeah. That's right.
Read what computer engineers write.
That's right.
Katie, how about you? Do you have what would be your advice to a new scholar that wants to take the first steps into learning what this digital life is?
So I'm trying to think of what were the lessons I learned from my dissertation, which was sort of my first foray into digital. And I started doing content analyses of the digital content to look at what were the different interactive features and things that happened when kids clicked or followed, certain click patterns. And so looking at that whole, understanding the text and what it can do and what it doesn't do, and sort of if I change this one thing, what's the cause and effect, if then logic. And you can get that on a largely visual sort of experiential scale. And if you know just this much about technology and the coding and the basic tenets of computational thinking, you can figure out without reading a lot of that stuff what it's all about.
I feel sort of like that this needs a collaboration, right? It sounds like the literacy scholars really need to collaborate with some of the computer science scholars. And I just think of with virtually connecting, this conversation, if Ken Bauer was on, he teaches computer science in Mexico. And just how interesting that there's a way that we should be able to connect the worlds to create that meta thing that we're looking for.
Interestingly, I'll just say, this is Elena. Hi, Brian, and I'm not sure who else is on there, but Elena Porzani. But one of the things I've been looking at recently is Massachusetts, where I work, a couple years ago came out with new digital literacy standards. And it's digital literacy and computer science standards thrown into one document. So it's all it's online reading and inquiry and research, and then also computer science and the same thing. And I've been wrestling with that a lot, and what the relationship is and why they put them into one document. So I don't have anything more to say about that than that, but there is a connection there, obviously. Although sometimes, my first reaction was, why did they put these things together? But in fact, it sounds like maybe you're saying there's good reason for that.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I can see some reasons for that, for sure, just in terms of the context, right? So just understanding all the contextual ideologies, the power structures that are built into the design of these digital environments, that's an important part of understanding any text that you find and deem as relevant to the inquiry that you're doing. So I can definitely see the connections there.
Well, and in the computer science world, there has been a lack of education around the ethical implications of what their software is, right? And so the lack of sort of that comes into the digital literacy pairing. So I think that, educating the next generation of programmers to actually think about what artificial intelligence impacts are going to be beyond, so I can totally see the combination.
One of the things that with the kids in my home that we read digital libraries like Epic and Skybrary, which is the Reading Rainbow stuff, and you know, you create a user profile there and an avatar, and you indicate like what things do you like. And I started to ask my daughter, who's selecting typical, you know, eight-year-old girl things like princesses and unicorns. I said, you know, what happens to the books that you see that are say you might also like when you click unicorn? What are you missing? And so simple things like that, when we teach children how to browse an actual physical library, we teach them about the different ways that genres are categorized and where you go to find this information and that information. And so I think using that sort of analogy for learning and thinking about how do we access the information in these digital contexts is a really important lever that we might sort of harness the force of.
While we are in this conversation, I'm curious as to how you guys dealing with, I say you guys because really this is not my particular area, much more of a, you know, local researcher, but wondering how you guys are addressing the idea of big data, how you guys are addressing the idea of artificial intelligence, how you guys are addressing the idea of vigilance in the sense of, you know, even face recognition. In my work, it impacts immigrant population.
Sure, at a different level.
At a very different level. So, you know, again, you know, because I live and breathe issues having to do with learning and diversity, I have to ask, you know, about the equity in some of these environments and how it impacts or affects different populations. I mean, it's too big of a question. I understand.
I mean, I think it connects well with what Elena said before, like around the relationship to actually between computer science and literacy. And there's a huge effort to teach computer science in the United States right now. And, you know, it's coming from all directions, public and private, but it's not being funded in a sustainable and equitable way, right? So everyone's saying that it's important. And there's debate about why it's important. Is it to make sure companies have, is it the economic argument, or is it around equity and civic participation? And you actually need to know it. You know, you have to know it because when the news says, you know, the election was hacked, like, what does that mean? Like, it's actually, it's a metaphor. Like, you have to actually understand what that means. So one of my criticisms of the way computer science education is rolled out in the United States is that, following the way a lot of other countries is doing it, is they're asking too many computer scientists what they should teach and how they should teach it. And it would be like, you know, we did this in English actually like 100 years ago, which was we were relying on lit professors and poetry, you know, to like tell us how to teach kids. And we found out, no, you need English education because someone has to translate all of that to the realities of lived experience in life. So when it comes to computer science, I've been advocating, like, no one has the money for a computer science teacher. Certainly it's not going to be in your budget forever. States don't even certify for computer science. So it's like this wild, wild west. But if it is as important as you're saying it is, you should be embedding computer science instruction and computational methods into all subject areas. It should be writing across the curriculum, coding across the curriculum, and the way in which coding is integrated into subject areas should deepen and expand the content area. So if you're an English teacher and you want to talk about big data, you can start to understand the way in which bigger data operate by helping students explore all of Shakespeare's works at once using very accessible data visualization tools that are openly available on the web. And you can work with students to pose new questions about the text that are only posable when you're looking at all of the data about the text distantly. So I do, when it comes to equity, I actually, when it comes to that question, I think sometimes our instinct is to like disrupt and innovate and try to do something very different. I think it's the opposite, actually. I think you need to co-opt the structures that aren't going anywhere and haven't, which are like the 4 or 5 main subject areas, and figure out how to co-opt them for the grander good and make sure it's sustained over time.
But I think, you know, my question is a little bit different. It has to do more with consumption, and it has to do more also with market value of data and how data is used.
That's an assumption there.
How, you know, we are not aware even how, you know, artificial intelligence is operating within and these systems that are feeding into neoliberalist kinds of ideologies. So how do we get our students to think critically about, you know, them as agents also on this side of
I think that there needs to be almost a curriculum intervention, right, to teach that sort of critical digital literacy about, you know, the participate sort of end of the web literacy framework with young children that is actually sort of scaffolded by knowledgeable adults who understand these algorithms and you know, the capitalism that's built into the web inherently. I think it would probably be really cool if you could have a teacher have a classroom Twitter handle and talk about what that means to make a friend, and what does it mean, you know, when you retweet somebody or when they retweet you, what does that do to your sort of capital civic power on the web?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I do what I was saying about computer science was in response to what you're saying, which is I think it's actually about looking at the interest in computer science education and embedding that into classes with these kinds of questions in mind. You know, so like one of the ways students can become more critical of the kinds of data that are being collected on them and how they are being used is by teaching the main content area teachers already, like teaching them how to weave in these kinds of questions and methods for understanding these kinds of questions into your curriculum. And I think any other approach, like I think it runs the risk of fading away eventually. So meaning like, so you don't reach out to the CS community, or you don't reach out even to like ISTE, you're reaching out to NCTE to talk to get it about English teachers. And you're reading, you know, so you're doing the opposite of what you might think you would want to do in a situation like that, because you need it to be sustainable over time.
In 2000, Rebecca, I think you had well, we're waiting to see, your blog was so influential in kind of your dissertation. It was part of the work, the stud, like the instrumentation, like tell us about that. Like, what was that like to make your website your tool of analysis in essence?
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience. In part, just a quick sort of highlight. I'm doing an autoethnography on a blog that I wrote through breast cancer treatment, and so there's the whole emotional aspect of having to relive it all over and over again through the analysis of it. But looking at the literacies and the knowledges that I gained, I can go back and I look back and I go, I didn't know these things. And so I look at some of the stuff that I had shared early on, and it's always the struggle of, when I reread it, it's wrong. Do I go back and change it? Do I go back and update it? What do I do with that? About your data, right? Because my knowledge clearly grew as sort of that sort of went on, and so it's been interesting researching that more. I don't know how you call it. It's more the right web, right, where you're writing to that public space.
And I think, to me, where does it all start? And it goes back to that early childhood conversation. Is I just want every kid to be able to answer my URL is. We were talking before the screen. We were talking with Michelle, like the blogging space, like it changes. It's that agentive writing, but the fact that you're shaping something physical that's also you, that's as physical as much as your clothes that you have on, it truly changes the space of literacies. And I think that will happen in the early childhood classroom. And I will post a think aloud of 7-year-olds learning CSS a little bit later. I have to edit it down because it's a think aloud and they're hard to watch. But you can do, if you can learn a sonnet, you can learn code. It's like knowing where a period goes in a sentence and knowing where a capital letter goes in a sentence is no different than knowing where a function starts and a function ends. Instead of filling them with, you fill them with variables.
So they call them programming languages for a reason, right? They're just languages.
That's right. And popular misunderstandings of the ones and zeros and how they operate, or the popular understanding that, oh, well, since computer science is rooted in mathematics historically, it means it's like super mathy. It's like, well, it was, but what's happened over the last number of decades is like we've developed layers and layers of more human readable languages, which means it's slowly become more of a linguistic engagement rather than necessarily a mathematical or quantitative one. So, things like grammar, syntax, all those terms, you're right, have great meaning in like programming.
Are there any questions from we have about 1 second left. Are there any questions or anything that people want to say from our remote attendees, our virtual buddies or guests? Anybody want to say anything? Have any questions for the audience or the panel? All right. If there are are there any questions from our on-site guests? Well, with that, let's just do a little bit of a wrap up, and I want to go around to a round robin and just tell everybody where they can find you on the web. And I guess we'll start again in the back with Jonathan.
I will be the first one. So you can find me on Twitter. Is probably the easiest at JT Bartels. Yeah.
It was a teaching strategy. I saw a student not paying attention. That's all it was.
I actually just I changed where my academic blog is, and my professional blog is now at rjhogue.name.
What?
Name.
I probably Twitter is the best way to find me at Paciga.
The best place to go is my blog is gradgrinds.com, and from there the Twitter, Insta, all that other stuff is there.
And mine is probably my website, which is chris.thesilva.
And you have a great website too. I like checking that one out too. And Tom, your PACE students, they started a homebrew website club that meets at PACE. So you should pop in sometime and check them out. They're a good group of kids.
I believe that. I will follow up on that. Thank you.
And with that being said, I want to go to our around through our virtual buddies. So I don't think Kristen can speak yet. So if you type in your contact info, I will let you know. And Lauren, where can we find you online?
You can find me at laurenzucker.org.
All right. And Michelle, I think you need, there you go.
Yeah, you can find me at mshirahegerman.com or on Twitter at mshegerman.
Vanessa?
Unmute. I'm presently scattered over several blogs and platforms and stuff. So I guess the best way is Twitter, and it's at Vanessa Vale. That way, I'm not going to forget what it is. It's
good strategy.
Wendy, if you want to, I know you're not feeling well, but if you want to share.
Yes, I'll just give you Kristen's first. It's at Kristen Gorski on Twitter, and on Twitter I'm at WenTail.
You're muted, Greg.
Oh, I said, Kristen, you're muted. We couldn't talk to you. But it would have been great to catch up. Thank you so much for joining us. And I am Greg McVary. You can find me pretty much anywhere if you just Google at JGMac1106. And I'm pretty much that everywhere on the web. My website is jgregorymcvary.com, but I'm in the middle of trying to get away from WordPress. So you'll find me out there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This has been a wonderful session sponsored by Virtually Connecting and the Literacy Research Association as a study group. I want to thank the conference organizers this year and conference chairs. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, how we do kind of feel we missed out not being there, but I want to thank everybody for being there because it felt like there's change in the air and real change, not like just like we should talk about change.
Sure, yeah. Can I ask
something felt different?
Lauren? I wanted to ask one question. Is that Lauren?
Yeah.
Lauren?
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if you learned how to do your chicken soup on YouTube.
Oh, good way to end.
No, I learned from good old-fashioned word of mouth. I asked a friend.
So our networks matter most, whether they're online or off. And I think that's a great way to end a session of Virtually Connecting. And with that, folks, I'm going to close out the show and call it a wraps and take us offline.